During a playful interview on live TV, Sandra suddenly froze mid-sentence after spotting a familiar woman in the crowd. Seconds later, she leapt from her chair and ran into the audience, leaving Jimmy Fallon and Keanu Reeves speechless as the studio realized who the mystery woman was and why Sandra owed her everything. What followed was an emotional reunion and a long-kept secret revealed in front of millions. The studio looked like every other late-night show: bright lights, polished desks, and a sea of faces half hidden in the dark. But the thing about nights like this is that nobody in the room knows when a life is about to change in front of millions of people. Sandra Bullock sat between Jimmy Fallon and Keanu Reeves, legs crossed, black sequin jumpsuit catching the light every time she moved. The audience had just finished cheering for their new action movie, and Jimmy was already in full late-night mode, bouncing in his chair, throwing jokes back and forth like rubber balls. Keanu smiled in that quiet, careful way he had, letting Sandra do most of the talking, occasionally dropping in a line that made everyone laugh harder simply because it came from him. On camera, Sandra looked completely at ease, witty, quick, playful. But there was a tightness in her shoulders she couldn't quite shake. Live television always did this to her. It wasn't the cameras or the questions, it was the distance between who she was expected to be and the memories she still carried. Somewhere behind the glam and the timing and the rehearsed stories, there was one face she could never forget. A woman she had seen only once, years ago, under broken glass and screaming sirens. A woman she had never properly thanked. Jimmy leaned in, shuffling his note cards. "Okay, so you two did your own stunts again," he said, grinning at Sandra and Keanu. "Tell me the truth, who almost died this time?" The crowd burst into laughter. Sandra laughed with them, exaggerating a guilty shrug, but for a split second her gaze slipped past the cameras and into the darkened rows of the audience. It was a habit now. She always scanned the faces, as if some part of her believed the past could be sitting right there, watching her perform. The house lights dimmed slightly, leaving the stage in a focused glow. But from where Sandra sat, she could still see enough: flashes of teeth, the glint of eyeglasses, a hand raised to adjust a scarf. And then her eyes stopped. Third row, a little to the left. A woman, maybe in her 40s now, hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing a floral blouse that didn't try to impress anyone. The rest of the room blurred. Sandra felt something inside her chest drop, hard and sudden, like missing a step on a staircase. She stared. The woman had the same calm posture, the same quiet way of sitting as if she was trying not to take up too much space. The same small silver necklace with a tiny, uneven heart charm. Sandra remembered that charm in a completely different light, flashing red, streaked with dust and blood, hanging above a pair of shaking hands that had refused to let go of her. Back then, the woman had been younger, her hair shorter, her face lined with strain and fear. But it was her. It had to be her. "Sandra," Jimmy's voice floated toward her through a tunnel of noise. You zoned out on us. Don't tell me you're doing stunts in your head right now." The audience laughed again, but this time Sandra didn't join in. Her palms had gone damp. She could feel Keanu glance sideways at her, quiet concern in the tilt of his head. This was live. There were rules, rhythms, invisible lines you didn't cross. You didn't stop a global interview because your past might be sitting in the third row. You didn't risk being wrong, risk humiliating a stranger on national television. And yet she remembered the sound of metal crushing in on itself, the smell of gasoline, the way that same woman had crawled across shattered glass to reach her when everyone else backed away, yelling about fire and risk and waiting for professionals. She remembered a soft, stubborn voice saying, "I'm not leaving you," while her own lungs fought for air. Sandra had promised herself then, through a haze of fear and morphine, that if she ever had the chance, she would find this woman again and repay that courage with something more than a rushed thank you whispered into an oxygen mask. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She watched the woman in the audience lower her eyes, as if she was used to not being noticed, even in a room lit by celebrities and cameras. And that broke something loose inside Sandra. Fame, etiquette, the entire machinery of the show suddenly felt small compared to the pounding question in her chest. What if this is your only chance? "I'm sorry," Sandra said quietly, half to Jimmy, half to herself. She pushed her chair back before her brain could talk her out of it. The audience tittered, confused, as she stood up. Keanu's hand lifted as if to steady her, but she was already moving, sequins catching every light as she stepped away from the safe little rectangle of the stage. Cameras swung wildly to follow her. Jimmy's mouth fell open. This was not in any script. Sandra didn't slow down. The studio floor seemed to tilt beneath her heels as she walked straight toward the audience, toward the woman who now stared back at her with wide, terrified eyes. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Security hesitated, unsure if this was a bit or a problem. Sandra stopped at the edge of the third row, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet somehow echoing through the silent studio. "Lena," she said, her eyes already shining. Is it really you?" The woman's lips parted, trembling, and in that suspended second, before she could answer, before anyone could make sense of what they were watching, every camera in the room was fixed on the space between them, waiting to see whether this was a mistake, or the moment a forgotten promise came back to life. For a long, fragile second, nobody moved. The crowd, the cameras, even the band seemed frozen in place, caught between curiosity and disbelief. The woman in the third row stared up at Sandra with the look of someone who had sworn never to be seen again. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her small purse, knuckles turning white. "It's you," the woman whispered. The microphone didn't pick it up, but the words reached Sandra anyway. Her throat closed. That voice, older, softer, but the same voice that had shaken with fear as it whispered, "Stay with me, please stay with me," over the sound of shattering glass. Jimmy half rose from his chair, eyes wide. Are we okay?" he said, his showman's instinct warring with the part of him that could tell this wasn't a bit. The audience gave a nervous chuckle, thinking maybe this was some elaborate surprise. Keanu stood now too, his gaze fixed on Sandra, ready to step in if she stumbled. "Can you come here?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling but clear enough for the nearest microphone to catch it. She held out her hand to the woman, who shook her head quickly, almost panicked. No, please," the woman murmured. "I didn't come here for that. I just wanted to see you from far away." Her eyes darted toward the cameras, red tally lights blinking like tiny warning signals. She shifted in her seat as if weighing the exit doors, calculating the distance between fleeing and staying. Somewhere off stage, a producer was almost certainly waving their arms, mouthing words like "commercial." And what is happening? But on the floor, everything narrowed down to Sandra and this stranger who wasn't a stranger. The years between them dissolved, and Sandra was back in that cold December night, the world upside down, seatbelt cutting into her ribs. She remembered the screech of tires, the violent spin, the sickening crunch when metal folded like paper. For a dizzy moment there had been only darkness and the taste of copper in her mouth. Then light, flickering, angry, painted red and blue across twisted steel. A pair of hands had appeared through the shattered window, fingers bleeding as they brushed glass aside. The same silver heart charm had swayed in front of her face, catching the streetlights while a woman's voice fought back panic. "I've got you. I'm not leaving. Look at me, look at me. I need you to come up here," Sandra said now, not as an actress, not as a guest on a talk show, but as a woman who had carried a stranger's courage like a secret talisman for years. "Just for a minute, please." The woman, Lena, closed her eyes. A war played out silently across her face, fear, shame, something like longing. Then she took a shaking breath and stood. The audience erupted in confused applause, thinking they were cheering for a surprise reunion. Sandra stepped back to make room as Lena moved slowly down the row, apologizing under her breath as she passed knees and handbags. Security hovered at the aisle, uncertain. Keanu gave them a small nod, a quiet signal that everything was fine. Jimmy pressed his hand over his heart, stunned, his showman mask slipping just enough for the cameras to catch the real, raw awe underneath. When Lena reached the edge of the stage, Sandra bent down and grabbed both of her hands, pulling her gently up the steps. Lena's palms were cold and damp. Up close, Sandra could see faint scars along her wrists, thin white lines that disappeared under her sleeves. She wanted to say 1,000 things. "Thank you, I looked for you, you saved my life," but the words jammed together in her chest. They sat side by side on the couch, two women illuminated by studio lights and decades of unfinished conversation. The audience quieted, sensing they were watching something they weren't supposed to see. "I've told this story before," Sandra said, voice unsteady. "About the car accident years ago, about the woman who pulled me out when everyone else stayed back. I never got to really talk to her." She turned to Lena, eyes shining. "This is her." The crowd gasped, then broke into loud, heartfelt applause. Some people stood, clapping for this stranger who had risked her life for someone they admired on a screen. Lena flinched at the sound, shoulders curling inward. She forced a tight smile, but her eyes stayed haunted. When the ovation finally died, she leaned close enough that only Sandra could hear her. Her whisper sliced clean through the noise, through the illusion that this was a simple, heartwarming reunion. "If they knew the whole story," Lena said, her voice cracking, "they wouldn't be clapping for me at all." The applause faded into a thick, uneasy hush as Sandra absorbed those words. Her stomach knotted. She pulled back just enough to see Lena's face clearly. There was no drama in her expression, no attempt to be mysterious, only the heavy, exhausted look of someone who had been waiting too long to confess something terrible. Jimmy glanced nervously toward the control booth, listening to the voice in his earpiece. He forced a thin smile. "Okay, we're gonna take a very quick break," he said, slipping back into host mode with visible effort. "Don't go anywhere." The band hit a soft transition riff. The applause sign flicked on, and the audience clapped again, though this time it felt more like habit than excitement. As soon as the cameras' red lights blinked off, the energy in the studio shifted. Stagehands moved in efficient blurs, adjusting cables and whispering to each other. Producers hurried toward the couch, but saw the look on Sandra's face and slowed, unsure whether to intervene. "What did you mean by that?" Sandra asked quietly, turning her full attention to Lena. The world outside their little corner blurred. The noise of the crew became a distant hum. "Lena, what whole story?" Lena stared down at her own hands, fingers twisting together until the scar on her wrist shone white. "I didn't want this," she said. "I didn't come here to ruin your show. My sister got tickets. She thought it would be fun. I didn't know you'd be here tonight. I thought," she laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. "I thought I could sit in the dark and clap for you and go home." "You didn't ruin anything," Sandra said firmly. "You saved my life." Lena flinched at that. "That night wasn't what you think," she murmured. "You were in the paper, the mystery woman who saved the movie star. Everyone made it sound so clean." Her voice thickened. "But I wasn't some angel who just appeared out of nowhere. I was part of the crash." The word hit Sandra like a slap. "Part of—" Her mind scrambled through half-remembered details. Lights, screeching tires, another car appearing out of nowhere. The police report her lawyers had handled. She had asked to see it once and then changed her mind, too shaken to relive it. Lena drew a breath like someone about to jump into deep water. "I'd been working a double shift at the diner," she began, eyes fixed on a point just above the audience. "I was exhausted. My ex had dropped our son at my sister's without warning. I was late to pick him up. I shouldn't have been driving. I definitely shouldn't have been looking at my phone." Her jaw clenched. "But I was, just for a second, a text from him, something stupid, and when I looked up, your car was right there." The studio around them seemed to fade as the memory took over. Rain on the windshield, streetlights smeared into streaks of gold. Lena's fingers slick with grease and soap from the diner sink, her phone buzzing in the cup holder. A red notification, one more message. She glanced down, the world tilted. By the time she looked up, headlights were screaming toward her like accusations. "I hit the brakes," Lena said, voice shaking, "but it was too late. The cars just slammed together. Yours spun. Mine hit the barrier, everything exploded into glass and metal. I remember the sound of you screaming." She swallowed hard. "And I remember thinking, this is my fault, this is all my fault." Sandra realized she was holding her breath. Images she'd pushed away for years came roaring back, shards glittering like ice, the sickening lurch as the car rolled, someone calling her name but through water. She had always pictured Lena as a stranger who happened upon the wreck, a miracle dropped into chaos. She had never imagined Lena had been trapped in that chaos too. "You still came for me," Sandra said softly. "I couldn't move at first," Lena whispered. "My door was jammed. I could taste blood. I could hear people shouting to get away. They were yelling about the gas leak. You were trapped upside down. The driver's side was crushed. I saw your face through the broken glass and I froze, because I knew the truth. I knew I was the reason you were there like that." Her eyes filled, but she forced herself to continue. "I wanted to run. I swear to you, for a moment I thought about crawling out and just disappearing. They'd blame the conditions, the rain, anything. They probably wouldn't even find me. But you were choking and you were scared, and I couldn't live with watching you die because I was a coward twice." She exhaled shakily. So I crawled over the glass. I cut my hands, my knees. I didn't care. I just thought, if I can get her out, maybe I won't be the worst version of myself anymore. Silence settled heavy between them. Around them, the crew pretended not to listen, but every nearby face had gone still. Jimmy stood a few feet away, cards dangling uselessly from his hand, his expression raw. "I never knew," Sandra whispered. There was a flicker of something sharp inside her, an instinctive anger that she shoved down just as quickly as it rose. It would be easy to cling to that anger, to the idea that her injuries, her nightmares, were someone's fault. But sitting this close to Lena, seeing the weight she had carried alone for so long, that anger had nowhere to land. "That night cost you a lot," Lena said, not looking at her. "The hospital, the therapy, the fear, your work, your body. And every time I saw your face on a poster, I remembered how close I came to ending it all. That's why I don't want their applause." She nodded toward the audience, still dimly lit, restless in their seats. "They think I'm a hero, but I'm the reason there was anything to be heroic about." A stage manager signaled frantically from the side, 30 seconds until they were live again. The band played a soft, uncertain vamp under the tension. Jimmy stepped closer, voice gentle. "We can stop," he said to both of them. "We don't have to put any of this on air. We can just say it was a technical break and move on." Lena wiped her cheeks, leaving faint lines in the makeup she'd applied so carefully for a simple night out. "No," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. "I'm so tired of hiding from that night. If I'm going to sit here, if I'm going to let them clap for me, then they should know who they're actually clapping for." She looked at Sandra, eyes red but resolute. "I'll stay, but only if I can say one thing to everyone watching when we go back on." The red tally light blinked on again, harsh and bright. The band's music faded, and the studio snapped back into that strange, electric quiet that only live television can hold. Jimmy eased into his chair, forcing a small, respectful smile that told the audience they had stepped into something more serious than a punchline. "We're back," he said carefully, glancing from Sandra to Lena. "And sometimes live TV does what it's supposed to do. It captures real life." He turned to Lena. "You said you wanted to say something. The floor is yours." Lena shifted on the couch, fingers laced so tightly they shook. For a second, the presence of millions of unseen viewers pressed on her like weight. But then she looked at Sandra, at the woman who might have every right to hate her, and yet was sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. The fear eased just enough for her to speak. "I'm not a hero," Lena said, voice steadying as she went. "I know that's how people told the story. Mysterious woman saves famous actress. It sounds nice. It makes you feel good, but that's not what happened." The audience leaned in, the room so quiet that the hum of the cameras was suddenly audible. "I caused the accident that almost killed her," she continued, each word like a stone laid carefully on the table between them. "I was tired, I was distracted, and I looked at my phone when I should have been looking at the road. My choices did this." She gestured faintly toward Sandra, not to her appearance, but to an invisible history of scars and sleepless nights. "I don't deserve applause for trying to fix something I broke." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not outrage, not yet, but a deep, unsettled shifting. People glanced at each other, struggling to hold both truths at once. "But," Lena added, taking a breath, "I also know this. You don't get to go back in time. You don't get to uncrash the car. All you can do is decide who you're going to be in the next second. Am I the woman who ruins someone's life and runs, or am I the woman who crawls across the glass and holds on until help comes?" Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "That choice, that second choice, that's the only part of that night I'm proud of." She turned to the audience fully now. "So if you're watching this and you've done something you're ashamed of, something you can't undo, you don't get to call yourself a hero for cleaning it up. But you also don't have to stay the person who did it. You can decide right now to be better. And then tomorrow you decide again. And again. That's the only way I've stayed alive after what I did." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then something shifted in the room, less like applause, more like a collective exhale as people recognized themselves in her confession. There were people in that studio who had run red lights, who'd said cruel things they couldn't take back, who'd walked away when they should have stayed. Her honesty cracked something open. Sandra swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. "You didn't ruin my life," she said suddenly, cutting through the quiet. You changed it. Yes, there were surgeries. Yes, there was pain. I was angry for a long time, even without knowing who to be angry at. She gave a small, wry smile. I yelled at a lot of pillows with your face that I'd never seen. A few people laughed softly, the tension easing for a second. But when I could finally think straight, Sandra went on, I kept coming back to one image, not the headlights, not the crash, you. She nodded toward Lena, eyes bright. Your hands, your face, the way you refused to leave me even when they were shouting for you to get away. You were bleeding, you were shaking, you stayed. It would have been so easy to run, and you didn't. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. We are all, every one of us, more than the worst thing we've ever done. My whole career is built on second takes. Getting another shot at a scene. Real life doesn't always give you that, but sometimes it does. And that night you took your second chance in the hardest, most dangerous way possible. Keanu, who had been quietly absorbing everything, leaned forward slightly. I've lost people, he said in his low, thoughtful voice. Sometimes to things they did, sometimes to things that just happened. The only thing I know for sure is that pain doesn't cancel out courage, and courage doesn't erase pain. They just live together. He looked at Lena. You didn't run from either. The audience sat in stunned silence. The usual late-night rhythm shattered and replaced with something slower, heavier, more honest. Jimmy's eyes shone as he watched, his showman's instincts overridden by the simple, human urge to let this moment breathe. Sandra turned back to the cameras, drawing herself up with a quiet resolve. There are a lot of people like Lena in this world, she said. People who messed up once and then spent years trying to make up for it. People who did something brave and then went back to small apartments and hard jobs and nobody ever knew their names. She looked at Lena, then back at the crowd. I've been thinking, even just in this last break, I want to start something. A fund, a scholarship, I don't know the exact shape yet. But something in your name, Lena, for second chances, for the people who decide to crawl through the glass instead of run away. The audience erupted into applause, this time loud and almost overwhelming. It wasn't just for Sandra's promise. It was for the idea that mistakes didn't have to be the end of a person's story. People stood, clapping and whistling, some wiping their eyes. But Lena didn't look relieved. If anything, she looked stricken. She shook her head, shrinking slightly under the weight of the attention. No, she said, her voice barely audible under the roar. Sandra leaned closer. Hey, it's okay, you deserve. I can't let you do that, Lena said, louder now, fighting to be heard over the cheering. You don't know what it cost me after I pulled you out. The applause stumbled and faded again. Sandra's smile faltered. What do you mean? She asked, dread curling at the edges of her words. Lena stared straight ahead, past the cameras, past the applauding strangers, into some point in her past that still hadn't released her. When I dragged you out of that car, she said slowly, I didn't just crawl away from my own wreck. I walked away from someone else who needed me just as much. She turned to Sandra, guilt carving deep lines across her face. There was another person in my car that night, she whispered, and I didn't go back for him.